So in this video I'm talking about Brunel's broad gauge track, and on this image here I have in front of us is one of the drawings by Bourne of the Great Western under construction. I think it's Sonning cutting, and you can see a number of typically Brunel features in this. On the right here are the contractor's tipper wagons running on some very poorly laid stone block rail track, but this is Brunel's broad gauge track, and this is a junction of that broad gauge track. And you'll see that unlike modern, or indeed from the late Victorian or mid to late Victorian period, the conventional cross sleepered track, which has sleepers every couple of feet, this track is supported under long wooden baulks for the whole of its length, and that's because the track itself, the rail itself, is bridge rail, which is really quite wrought iron bridge rail, which is really quite comparatively weak. But this was about the limit of technology when Brunel was first making the Great Western, so he adopted this form of support for the rail, and then he just these are ties. They just make the gauge. They're not providing support. They're providing gauge control. So, and this is a junction here. Here's a bobby, a railway policeman with his little booth, his little bothy behind him, a bobby's bothy. And this is a point indicator, the indicator showing which way the junction is set. And at each junction initially there was one of these bothies with a policeman to control it, and that's why signalmen in the Great Western Railway for many years, well into the 20th century, were known as bobbies. Okay, so that was the aim that I was trying to recreate in Trainz. So if we go down to Trainz, let's find Trainz, here we are, and this is what I've managed to do, to create the track as procedural track. That is, in the past I've made junctions, scenery items to which you add the normal spline track, but I've never found them very satisfactory because of course they were fixed in their radii, and there wasn't much in the way of complexity to them. But this is my this is where I've got as far as creating procedural track for broad gauge. So this is for Trainz and better, Trainz and 2019 and better, that sort of thing. So if we zoom in there, you can see now I've had to make quite a few compromises in order to make this work. But it does work, and I've really got to thank John, that's Teddy Toot is his username, for really getting me back literally on track with this, because he and I have in the past have tried to create mixed gauge track and sort of got 80% of the way there, but it was never really successful. I was never really that happy with it, and I don't think John was either. I'm sure he wasn't, but it's been very frustrating trying to create that, and we've tried all sorts of tricks and techniques, and we're going to have another go. But in the meantime, the first stage was to make procedural track for Trainz a New Era and Trainz 2019, and this will replace all of those wired up or scripted animated junctions which poor old Andy 06 produced, and which I copied with his permission, of course. I copied his script, but I found that there was a problem with them certainly in my version of Trainz. John didn't have those problems for some reason in his version. We checked it. I redid the database of mine. I went online and everything like that to try and find out what was wrong, but for some reason the script just isn't functioning properly. So there's an earlier video on YouTube of how to wire up my old animated junctions. That's really defunct now. It would only be suitable for earlier versions of Trainz. To replace all of those junctions, I decided that I would have a go at making procedural track, and I made a complete mess of it. I'm not worried about mentioning it, so here we are. Let's just make a junction, and then always of course make sure the foot's straight. Now this is not released yet, but this is now using all of my own meshes. I had trouble with the rail mesh and the wing rail and the check rail meshes before, when I tried to do it before John stepped in and really put me straight and got me well and truly sorted. And so now we're in the process of checking that this is actually working okay. So I'm just flipping the junctions here, clicking the junctions just to show you that's working okay. And so once it's finished, as finished as I can make it, then I will release it on my website as broad gauge procedural track. Now there are a number of issues, naturally enough, because what I'm doing is I'm ripping into basically, let's go up here to some, I'm trying to remember now, is it under Tain? I think it is. I'm ripping into, I mean this is what or an N3V have produced. This is their own procedural track with a very bad junction there. I like the way these spline points turn red when this is clearly a very, very poorly laid out junction, and as you bring it in, of course, you can get a proper junction then that turns white to indicate that it's okay. So what I've done is I've adapted the way in which the program, the Trainz program, creates these junctions from this procedural track, and I've adapted a number of issues in order to make it work. And the first thing, of course, is that because Brunel's track hasn't got the same logic behind it as this track, which is a much more the conventional modern track, which is flexible, allows track to move like up and down, like I say, you know, a caterpillar going along with a hump, you know. So there's a train the track will flex down and rise up in the ballast as the train goes by. If you don't believe me, get up close safely, get up close to a piece of track and have a look as the train goes by. I can assure you it does. And of course, and that's why track ballast needs regular retamping to create the correct profile to bed the sleepers into it. So that's the sleepers, chairs to hold the rails, and then the rails themselves. That's the conventional setup. Completely meaningless when it comes to Brunel, of course. Completely different way of doing things. So the ballast was straightforward. I could stick with that. I could keep that. The rails, to an extent, I can keep those. I did experiment with different ways of doing those, but I'm happy enough with these now. Sleepers and chairs, big problem. Chairs not so much so, because there was like a strip of wood underneath the rail, between the rail and the longitudinal timber which bedded into the ballast, which acted like a chair, and to which the bottom edges, the flared out bottom edges of bridge rails, I think I've got a picture of bridge rails, let's have a look. Where are we? Yeah, there's a bridge rail. Zoom in, it's very pixelated, but there you are. So it's these bits here which were pinned down. You can see there, look, where the bits went in. So let's just go back to Trainz. So yeah, so those bridge rails that are supported the entire length, which is very good indeed. So what did I do? Well, after a lot of mucking about, and with the assistance of Rob, who I must mention, who helped all the way from Australia, from the Trainz team in Australia, and he basically resolved how I can spread the sleepers out here. This straightforward alteration. I was very loath to go into the configs of the different constituent files and adjust them, but you know, had to go because I was worried about it crashing trains and all this sort of thing. But anyway, so that's how these cross pieces are done. But of course, when it comes to the junction, then it pretty much blows the brains of the way in which the Trainz procedural track has been set up for this, because it wants to do this business here. Look, you can see where there's quite a few of these cross timbers have appeared, but I'm trying to get it to do this, which is 6 foot apart. These are 10 foot apart. Brunel later increased the number of cross timbers at junctions, but you know, without being too purist about it, I'm no rivet counter. So really what I've tried to do here is to make something that approximates the look of the broad gauge track and go on with the flow. And when there's been a problem, if it's not too serious, then I'm just accepting it as that. If I come up here, let's just go back a bit. Now what you can do is, by moving the junction, you can actually just by adjusting it a little bit, you can lose some of those. You can, yeah, look, see, it's made it quite nice there. So what you need to do is to be careful with your spline points, and add extra ones maybe here if you don't get. It's the first time I've ever been able to create it like that. That's amazing. That's really nice, isn't it? Okay, now the other thing is there's a whole series of compromises here, which, first of all, of course, the ballast overlap, so you do get this sort of shimmering effect, flickering effect at times, which I can't really do much about. There may be some clever person out there who can tell me what to do, in which case I'll have a go. But that's effect. And also, so this longitudinal timber and what I'm calling a chair, which is, if we zoom right in, you can see that dot there, that's meant to be a bolt head. I've kept this all very, very low res. It's just to try and give the effect, not to try and create something that's as sharp and defined as the Oran N3V procedural track, because that's, you know, meticulous and brilliant, but I couldn't really go down that route on this because I have to make so many compromises. So what I've done here is the chair and the longitudinal sleeper are in sections, and they're repeated by the AI or by the program along here as if they were chairs here. So the chair in my model is actually the longitudinal timber and that strip of wood that went underneath the bridge rails, and I've told it to reproduce that. Oh, there's John come back with curious just while I'm recording this, so I must have a chat with him. So just close that. And so these bits and pieces here are reproduced quite frequently. In fact, they overlap because they are long meshes, and quite long meshes that I put in here to replace the individual chair. Instead of a chair, I've got a long strip of timber and then another strip of timber underneath, representing the chair and the baulk underneath, and then I've told it to basically, I've persuaded it to join them all together, but there is some overlap, and I'm not going to muck about with it. I'm not going to, so you can see that flicker in there just for a moment. I'm there, look, yeah, I'm just picking it up. See if I zoom in a bit there. That's where these chairs are overlapping. Frankly, if I start mucking about with it, I'm frightened that I'll just banjax the whole thing. So so that's one of the compromises I've had to make. So the sleeper is actually the cross baulk here, and because the junction creation algorithm, whatever it is, stretches the sleeper out to make these long ones here until the end of the junction, and then it separates them out again. So I had to use that function. I had to use it for the cross baulk. So the chair function, or the chair element, I've used for the chair and the longitudinal cross baulk. Now the other aspect I found is that if you look at a nice bit of standard gauge track at the frog, it makes a nice frog. Okay, that looks nice. Mine isn't so good, I have to admit. Maybe I can do a bit of something there, that break. It's because of the nature of the chair and the cross baulk there. So but I think it's a reasonable facsimile. I would be loath to alter it now, and the check rails are a little bit tight compared to these ones here, I think. Where are we? Yeah. And I will have a poke about with that, but again, it's all to do with the check gauge, the gauge of the check rails, and I tried that with my first go, and the whole thing went bonkers. And it's all related to the positioning, I think, here of these wing rails, where they join the piece of rail that's been chopped off by the programming which creates the junction, because this is just a piece of continuous rail, and it's the program itself which carves it up into that position. So anyway, there we are. I think overall, compared to the animated junctions of scenery junctions, I think it's pretty close. The scenery junctions, the ones I made before, which were scenery items which you plonk down, were fixed junction angles. You couldn't do much with it. beyond what I'd set. So whether they were wired up or using the script, as I say, the wired up ones actually still work in tame, I discovered. Brilliant. But the others, the scripted ones using Andy's script alone, they would just, if I clicked on them, if I change them like this, there we go. So if I change the junction, they would work once, and then if I save this and put another one in, that one would work, but the first one wouldn't. So not a clue what's causing that, and frankly I'm not worried because I've not released them again. I think some may be on the download station, but they're not on my website, and I'm not going to put them on there. This will replace those junctions, which is why you can see now why I worked so hard on procedural track. And believe me, it was a lot of, really you've got to think laterally here to try and persuade a system which is completely unlike this system, our conventional system over on the right. It's really quite difficult to persuade that system to work for this Brunel system. And goodness knows what fun we're going to have when we try and introduce mixed gauge track. My mind boggles, I don't think. But we'll give it a go, see what we can do. Now, in addition to this, in addition to the procedural track, seems to be, touch everything wooden, including the head, seems to be working okay. What I'm intending to do is to, once John and I have checked this over, and maybe we'll beta test it somewhere else as well, what my intention is because when you get this procedural track, let's move that other procedural track here, where are we, and of course, and you want a diamond crossing. This is one of those features which they've not implemented, I suspect it's going to mean a whole series of complicated coding in Trainz in order to achieve that. So of course when we get let's put that track there. So when we get a double junction, let's make sure it doesn't. So when we get a double junction or a, let's add a bit more. Oh, wrong one. Let's pick up the right one. Let's go over to there. Then of course, let's bring another one over here. This is the problem I'm thinking about. That when we get a junction like this, a double junction, which it wasn't all that common, it must be said, on the Great Western. No, it did happen, certainly. I'm always nervous. Yeah, it is working. Yeah, it's just because of the problems I've had in the past. Now, obviously, I've just laid that down, and so I haven't worried about. This is the bit you just got to tidy up with extra spline points or moving your spline points about, just to get that looking right. My intention is to create the diamond, to create a diamond crossing. At the moment, that positioning is incorrect for Brunel's double track, because there should only, the track gauge is 7 foot, but the gap between the two facing rails here, this gap here, should be only 6 foot. So actually the gap between the rails is less than the gauge of the rails, which makes for a lot of difficulties when you try and where am I? Oh, I'm in the wrong. Wait a minute. What I'm thinking of doing, what I'm thinking here is, I just want to show you. If I move that over, we've actually got to come to about there. Let's just move this over. Hold down the shift key and move it over a bit. I'm not in the right. I'm usually a stickler for the geometry, but I'm just showing you here. So here, for example, I think that's probably that's more than 6 feet there. So I've got to. It's this shape that I've got to produce, and I think I've got to produce 3 of them. I've got to produce a diamond like this. I've got to produce at least 3, because of course if I do a great, if we make this a greater angle here, let's put the shift key down so I don't join it up. This changes every time, for every degree. Now you might be happy with that. I would like to do I'm going to do scenery items that will replace that. So you'll connect the spline to a connecting point there will be a scenery item, and then you carry on your spline after that, which may improve the look of these cross baulks as well. But also that, I mean, there's at least 3, so there's going to be one for a diamond for where there's so it's effectively a Y junction, but also of course it needs to be let's just move these over a bit. Let's imagine we're in Swindon and the junction for Cheltenham is heading off to the right, so you'll see straight away what I'm talking about. This piece. Now the geometry of that of course is different to the Y one I just showed you, the Y junction, and so I definitely need to make that, possibly with a small piece of fixed track. It'll all be fixed track rail there and fixed track rail there, to which you join the splines. So you'd have 1, 2, 3, 4 at each end. 1, 2, 3, 4 connecting points for your splines. So, but I've got to experiment. I've got to see how it goes and see what John says as well, how he's finding it all. So there we are, the broad gauge procedural track. I wanted to post up this video because I had posted a couple of points on the forum and moaned and groaned and tore my hair out, such as it is, and despaired about getting it working, but now it is. So so there we are. Now it's not going to come out in my next website update. It'll be a couple of months at least, I think, before I'm ready to release this, or I'm happy enough to release it. And I will also release a guide to making the junctions at the same time and put it on YouTube alongside this. I'll leave this video on just to for anybody who's interested, just to see the sort of machinations involved in trying to create this sort of track. But I love procedural track. I think it's wonderful. I was delighted when let's have a bit of this. I was delighted when Trainz started producing procedural. They started producing procedural track, because I just, proper track work is essential. I think the geometry of the track is absolutely key for me. I love what you can do now. It really is such a great boost, I think. I love it, and really pleased with it. And I've got it down to 3 foot for the Donegal Railway, and now I'm up to 7 foot, having previously thought I couldn't go past 4.5 foot for some reason. The wretched so-called standard gauge. Well, it might be standard gauge as far as George and Robert Stevenson are concerned. But as far as I'm concerned, it's a narrow gauge, because it's too narrow for the broad gauge, Brunel's brilliant broad gauge. And I'm recording this in Belfast, and our standard gauge here isn't 4 foot 8.5, it's 5 foot 3. And if you talk about the narrow gauge in Ireland, you're talking about 3 foot. So there. So that's my take, a somewhat euphoric take on broad gauge procedural track. And it will be available, this summer, and I will spend time and produce those junctions there, so as to make it as flexible as possible, or at least to maintain the geometry on some conventional junctions. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. A little bit different to some of my usual ones of how to make things. It's very much just a report on how I'm getting on with procedural track. So if you have enjoyed it, and if you have any questions at all about the procedural track or about Brunel's beautiful baulk road, you see the difference there between those and that? Yeah, if you have any questions at all about the way Brunel built it and that, I did put a video up earlier, just sort of before, about the history of this and what he did and how he laid it out, and the gauge wars. Just a few, you can read everything of that in a book or on Wikipedia, but I just like to put them up onto YouTube as well. Okay, so there we are. Leave a comment, leave a question. Please give me a thumbs up if you like the video, and please subscribe to my channel, ING for Trainz.